This happened about 2 years ago in Montana, but I think about it almost every day. I'm finally writing it out because the nightmares haven't stopped, and I feel like maybe putting it into words will help me sleep. We were camping in Glacier National Park. My wife and I had done tons of car camping and a few backpacking trips together before, but this was our first time in grizzly country. We were both pretty cautious by nature and did all the standard things: bear spray, bear canister stored away from the site, cooking far from the tent, no scented items inside of the tent, all that. It was late August and the weather had been dry and clear. Warm days, cold nights. We had 2 nights booked at this primitive campground. I won't say the exact one, but if you've been to Glacier, you'd probably know it if I did. It was small, only about 8 sites, spaced out a decent bit, but still within shouting distance. The first night was uneventful. I remember sitting out by the fire with my wife, watching stars, feeling that surreal calm that only comes with being miles away from cell service and roads. No light pollution, no noise but wind in the trees, and the occasional distant howl or hoot. One of the other campers came over at one point to say hi, an older woman, probably in her 60s, solo camping. We made small talk. She said she was retired and traveling the country in her Subaru, camping at every national park she could hit. A really friendly lady. She was staying in the site one over from us, maybe 40 to 50 feet through the trees. I remember her saying how peaceful it was out there, how she hadn't seen a single bear the whole trip. That was the last thing she ever said to us. Around 3 a.m. the second night, I woke up suddenly. You know that feeling when something just feels wrong before you're even conscious of it? That was what jolted me awake. My wife was still asleep, breathing softly beside me. Then I heard it, shouting. A man's voice, urgent, coming closer. "Get in your car, everyone, get in your car right now." I sat bolt upright. The voice was getting louder, closer, shouting the same thing on repeat. It wasn't panicked exactly, but forceful, trained. My heart started pounding. I unzipped the tent and peeked out. A flashlight beam swept past our site. A man in a ranger uniform was moving quickly from site to site, banging on cars, yelling, "Do not stay in your tents. Get in your vehicle. There's a bear in the area, a grizzly. Get in your vehicle." I didn't even stop to think. I grabbed my wife, shook her awake. She was groggy and confused, but sat up fast when she saw my face. "We need to go now." "Bear," I said, already pulling on my boots. She didn't ask questions. We didn't bother packing anything. We just ran, clutching our headlamps and keys. The walk from the tent to the car was maybe 50 feet, but it felt like miles. Every shadow looked like something moving. Every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. We got in, locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad, I couldn't get the keys in the ignition. I saw other cars turning on, people inside, some with lights on, some still in the dark. The ranger was still moving through the camp. Then he stopped at the site next to ours, the woman's tent. Her car was there, but no movement, no lights. I saw the ranger stand still for a beat too long. Then he unholstered his sidearm. Something in my stomach dropped. I watched through our windshield as he called in on his radio, with a fast but low voice. Another ranger vehicle pulled up maybe a minute later, lights off, silent. A woman got out, also a ranger, and they both approached the tent. The rest is kind of a blur. I remember watching them unzip the tent slowly. I couldn't see much from where we were, but I heard something I'll never forget. The female ranger made a noise, not quite a scream, just this involuntary gasp, like all the air escaped her lungs. Then she turned away and bent over. I think she was throwing up. We found out the next day that the woman, the same one who chatted with us the night before, had been killed in her sleep. A grizzly had torn open her tent and dragged her out. The rangers told us later it was probably over in seconds. She didn't even have time to reach for the bear spray they found still clipped to her belt. They didn't find the bear until 2 days later, miles from the campsite. They tracked it by helicopter and ended up euthanizing it. The rest of that night was a mix of fear and adrenaline, and this deep, raw horror that I still don't have the words for. We sat in the car, headlights off, watching the silhouettes of the rangers move through the trees. One came over eventually, a young guy who looked like he hadn't slept in days. He confirmed that there had been a fatality and that they were treating the whole area as an active danger zone. They were evacuating everyone. We needed to follow the convoy out in 30 minutes. We didn't sleep. Nobody did. In the days after, the story made the news. You might have read about it. Solo camper killed in grizzly attack in Glacier. They never released her name publicly, thank God. But we recognized the details. They also didn't mention in most reports that there were other campers literally feet away, that we heard the bear before we realized what it was. Low, heavy breathing, footsteps, the sound of nylon tearing. That part stays with me. I want to be clear, we did everything right. She did everything right. This wasn't about food left out or someone doing something careless. It was just one of those horrific freak things that happen in the wild. Sometimes predators don't act like we expect them to. Sometimes the worst case scenario just happens. I don't blame the rangers. They were incredibly professional, and you could see how much it affected them. But I do think the park downplayed the danger in the weeks after. There were reports of bear activity in the area before that night. Scratched trees, a couple of false charges along trails. I wish they'd closed the campsite, but wishing doesn't do much. We haven't camped since. I think about her a lot. A stranger, someone we talked to for maybe 5 minutes over a fire. I wonder what her last thoughts were, if she even woke up. But I hope not. I hope it was fast. This happened back in 2009, but it still lives rent-free in my head. I've told a few friends in person over the years, but I've never written it down before. Back then, I was 22 and doing a long-distance hiking trip with 2 mates. Our plan was to take on a big chunk of the Pennine Way, just over 150 miles from the Peak District up into Northumberland. We weren't purists about it, weren't doing every single mile, but we were out there for 2 weeks, camping as much as possible to save money. The incident happened somewhere between the Yorkshire Dales and North Pennines. I won't give the exact grid reference because, frankly, I don't want anyone poking around and getting themselves into trouble. It was late August, that odd end of summer period where the sun hangs around late, but the shadows feel longer. We'd spent the day on a brutal section of trail, boggy terrain, sheep tracks pretending to be paths, and a stiff wind that somehow managed to hit us in the face, regardless of which direction we were walking. We pitched up near a small copse on the edge of moorland, one of those semi-sheltered areas that's just enough cover to count as wild camping, without being completely exposed to the elements. There was a stream nearby, some higher ground behind us, and, critically, flat land for tents. We got our kits sorted and had a quick boil-in-the-bag meal. One of my mates, Ryan, realized he'd lost his jacket somewhere along the previous stretch. Lightweight windbreaker, nothing fancy, but it had his wallet and train pass in it, so he was keen to go back. He asked if I'd come with. Dan, our third guy, stayed behind to keep the fire going and prep some tea. So, off we went, retracing our steps as best as we could. We never found the jacket. After an hour of searching, Ryan gave up and turned back. I stuck around for a bit longer, half out of stubbornness, half enjoying the solitude. I've always liked that feeling you get on the trail. No signal, no traffic, just your boots and breath, and the world pressing in close. But it was getting dark, fast, and, in classic unprepared fashion, I didn't have a proper torch with me. This was back before smartphones had flashlight apps, so I was using the glow of my old HTC screen to light the way. It barely lit more than a few feet, but it was enough to follow the trampled grass path and not fall into a bog. I was about 15 minutes from camp when I saw them, 2 men, standing in a clearing just off the trail. They hadn't seen me yet, so I froze behind a thin cluster of trees. I don't know why I ducked down. Instinct, maybe. Something felt off. The 2 of them were standing over a hole, a proper one, deep, rectangular, fresh. You could see the wet soil piled up beside it. They had 2 spades and were maneuvering something large and metallic toward the edge. It made a clanging sound as it scraped against the edge of the hole. That's what first struck me, how loud and wrong the sound was, echoing in the quiet woods. Whatever they were burying wasn't a person. I'm fairly sure of that. The way they moved it, the noise it made, it was solid, industrial, like a machine or heavy container. They got into the hole and stood there for a few seconds. One of them said something I couldn't make out. It was low, deliberate, not a chat, not small talk, more like a declaration, a sentence with weight to it. The second guy nodded. Then they started filling in the hole. They weren't rushing, no panic, just focused, like they were doing something they'd done before. I stayed crouched, barely breathing, my phone screen dimmed. They didn't look like hikers. No rucksacks, no trail clothes. One was wearing jeans and a dark fleece, and the other in old work trousers and a hoodie. They both wore gloves. They didn't look up once. Eventually, they finished the job, smoothed the earth. One of them lit a cigarette and stood there for a moment, just staring at the ground. Then, as casually as you like, they picked up the shovels and walked off in the opposite direction, deeper into the woods. I didn't move until I was sure they were gone. Then I ran. I didn't even try to find the trail again. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, half blind with adrenaline and that primal sense of you were never meant to see that. I must have looked insane when I burst back into camp. Ryan and Dan both jumped when I showed up. I told them what I'd seen, probably too fast and too jumbled to make proper sense. They laughed at first, said maybe it was someone burying an old fridge or scrap metal or some stolen gear, but I couldn't shake it. That clang when it hit the bottom, the silence afterward, the way they stood over it like they were giving it a funeral. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing twigs snap outside the tent. It could have been deer. It could have been nothing. It could have been them. We moved on the next morning, cutting the trip short by a day. Not because of what I saw officially. We told ourselves we were just tired. Weather was turning. But I think they could feel it too. The weirdness. A few days later, while resupplying in a village near Alston, I got chatting with an older guy behind the till at the general store. Friendly sort. When I mentioned we'd been camping near a particular wood just off the trail, his smile dipped slightly. He didn't say much, but he said this. Yeah, some places on the way have long memories. You'll hear stories. Best to keep moving through. That's all he said. Then he rang up my oatcakes like nothing happened. When I got home, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, started Googling around about dumping grounds, military leftovers, urban legends around the Pennine Way. Did you know there were old Cold War listening stations and radar outposts scattered near the trail? That they sometimes buried obsolete equipment rather than hauled it out? Some of it was probably harmless, but what if some of it wasn't? What if that thing they buried wasn't junk, or trash, or a robot for laughs? What if it was sealed for a reason? I've never gone back to that stretch of the Pennine Way. I still hike, still camp, but I keep it to the lakes, well-trodden areas. And I always bring a proper torch. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that metallic clang in my head, like something waking up under 6 feet of earth. This happened when I was 15, near Algonquin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I was always so amazed at the beauty of Algonquin Park and Muskoka, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every summer. Our cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages on the lake. During the summer, the lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage country, so people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and warm nights around campfires with family and friends. I spent every summer there growing up, and it still brings fond memories of sunshine and laughter, and the sound of motorboats on the lake. But the winters were different. The people that didn't live there all year would venture back home to the city life, leaving the area mostly deserted, with cottages boarded up for the winter. There were a few people that would still frequently come up every couple months for a few days or so, but for the most part, the lake was silent during the winters, and the town was just filled with locals. The beautiful pine trees are always covered with snow, making the forest quiet. Our cottage was on a dead-end road. There were about 20 other cottages on the road, with ours being somewhat in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out, however, with our closest neighbors being too far away to see through the trees. My dad had needed to head up to the cottage to do some painting that my mom had been bugging him to do. It was at the end of February, and it was a long weekend, so I tagged along so he wouldn't be alone, and we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive from our home, but turned out to be an 8-hour drive due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark out quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove through Algonquin Park. It was deadly quiet and pitch black, except for the headlights of the car. We finally passed through the park, with only about 30 minutes left to get to the cottage. It had stopped snowing, and we were both eager to get there. As we turned onto the familiar road, I remember my dad cursing. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't be until later the next day that we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the road, I noticed there was a fresh set of tire tracks. The Smiths must be up for the weekend, my dad had said. All of a sudden, as we drove around the bend, following the tire tracks, the headlights of a car shone on a white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost hidden by the vast trees that were covered with snow. What the? My dad mumbled. As we drove past the white van, I remember looking back through the back window and very clearly seeing 2 figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. I told my dad this, and he shrugged. Maybe they're lost. I nodded, but couldn't help to think about how it was a dead-end road and why they would feel the need to park there. As we pulled into our driveway, we started bringing our stuff in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about the van and why it was parked there, with 2 people just sitting in the dark in the middle of the night. It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him, instead of sleeping downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds, that looked out into the blackness of the forest, and my 15-year-old self was already scared of the dark, even without seeing the white van. It wasn't a big deal when my sister was there, but not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned all the lights off, and I was just using a small lamp next to the couch to try and get through one last chapter before bed. It was so quiet, I could almost hear my ears ringing. I also started to get the feeling that I was being watched. The living room had large windows, also with no curtains, that overlooked the lake, and it was black, except for a light or two from the cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now that the cottage was dark, the moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was beautiful, and I walked towards the window to get a better look. Movement caught my eye, and I remember my heart dropping as I saw two figures down by the back porch, below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled towards the bedroom where my dad was sleeping, my heart in my throat. I wasn't sure if they'd seen me or not. I woke my dad up, and by the time he got to the window, the two figures were gone. Where I had seen the figures, two sets of footprints in the snow led back around to the front of the cottage and back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare anyone off. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I remember being very freaked out, and I lay there all night next to my dad, terrified I'd look out the window and see someone staring back at me. The next morning, my dad went outside and confirmed that there were two sets of footprints leading from the road to behind our cottage, and then back around to the front of the cottage and back up to the road. There were tire marks that showed the vehicle had turned around and then gone back up to the main road. My dad guessed that they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff, as it was in the middle of the winter, and not too many people were up at the lake. But they knew we were there. They would have seen our tracks leading to our cottage, and my dad's car parked out front. They also may have seen the lamp I turned on to read and or seeing it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to that. And after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently, there'd been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from the cottages that were boarded up for the winter. But again, and I still wonder to this day, why would they be interested in stealing from a house that clearly has people inside of it? This is something that I've thought about for over 20 years. When I was a teenager, I stumbled onto something that's haunted me ever since. This was the summer of 2001. I was 14, growing up in north central Oregon, a logging town that's not even on most maps. Most of the land behind our neighborhood was leased by a private company for logging, but no one really enforced the no trespassing rules, unless you were poaching deer. That summer, a group of 4 of us were trying to follow a dry creek bed we hadn't explored before. It twisted through heavy second-growth forest and eventually opened into a small clearing we didn't recognize. Tucked into the far edge of that clearing was an old farm. From a distance, it looked like something out of an old western. 2-story farmhouse, rusted metal roof, a barn with half its roof caved in, and fencing that was mostly collapsed. It didn't look burnt or storm damaged, just like everyone had left a long time ago. We were curious, and more than a little dumb, so we checked it out. The front door was unlocked. Inside, it was like someone had left in the middle of the day and just never came back. The living room had furniture, a dusty TV set, a few kids' toys in a woven basket. Magazines from the summer of 1968 were still on the coffee table. A pair of reading glasses were sitting next to them, like someone had just taken them off. The dishes were in the sink, cans and boxed food in the pantry. Jars of preserves lined the shelves. Most had burst or leaked, but some were still intact. One bedroom had sheets on the bed and a suitcase on the floor that was half packed. The closets still had clothes. Everything was old, decaying and dusty, but it was all there. The weirdest part, it wasn't vandalized. No broken windows, no trash, no graffiti. It was like the place had just been sealed away. Outside, the barn was full of old tools, a rusting pickup truck and animal skeletons, goats, pigs, even what looked like a horse. They were all long dead, bones dry and picked clean. It looked like they just starved or been left behind. We didn't see anything like blood or bullet holes, but we all felt off, unsettled, like we shouldn't be there. After an hour, we left. The thing that really stuck with me was how sudden it felt. People don't leave mid-meal. They don't abandon full pantries and half-packed bags. Something happened. We just didn't know what. We tried to go back a few months later, but we couldn't find it again. I know how that sounds, but the logging roads out there change. Trails get overgrown, and none of us thought to bring a compass or GPS the first time. Years later, I was in college. I was bored and started Googling, trying to find old land records from the area. I came across a forum post from a local historian who mentioned a missing family from that same area in the late 60s, parents and 2 kids. No police report, no formal investigation, just gone. A neighbor reported them missing, but there wasn't enough evidence to treat it like a crime. The land was eventually marked as abandoned and sold off to the timber company. There was one comment under the post from someone claiming to be a relative of the family, saying the whole thing was buried quietly by the county, that no one wanted to talk about what might have happened. Then that comment was deleted a few days later. I've searched for more information, but there's barely anything. No news articles, no missing person flyers archived online. Just that one mention and what we saw that day. I don't know what happened out there. A murder-suicide, forced disappearance, something criminal hidden behind rural silence and red tape. Who knows? But what I do know is that entire family vanished, and that house, with everything left behind, felt like it was waiting for someone to come back. But no one ever did. I was backpacking with my dog, and about 12 miles from the road and trailhead, so pretty far from people, though popular enough that other hikers might be around. But we saw no one all day. At about 2 a.m., my dog started this really low, deep growl and wakes me up. I turn on my headlamp and see his teeth showing, and he's right on top of me. I hear heavy footsteps, a black bear or moose maybe, near the tent. I leash my dog so he doesn't tear through the tent, and the footsteps move further away, but keep circling my tent. All of my food and toiletries are hung in a tree in a bear bag. There's nothing in the tent to draw a bear's attention. I clap my hands. Something is still slowly circling. Not something a moose would do, and a bear might if he wanted food, but I've got nothing and a really big dog with me. I decided to step out of the tent with a leash in one hand and bear spray in the other, yelling, "Hey, bear!" The footsteps stop. The dog's nose is in the air, telling me to look right, but nothing in my headlamp that I can see. I didn't hear anything run off, but it's quiet. I give it 5 minutes or so, get back in the tent, and it starts up again, slowly circling maybe 50 feet from me. Maybe an hour later, I hear the footsteps wander off into the woods. At dawn, I take the dog and the bear spray and start looking for tracks. I find a clear path in the leaves that had been trampled, but no tracks. The dog's nose is on the ground, and I follow his lead, and he follows the loop around the campsite. We finally see a few human footprints. No shoe tracks, a regular size, not Bigfoot, bare human foot. Plus, yeah, human fecal matter and toilet paper. Some asshole was wandering around in the middle of nowhere, near the tent, and circling it for an hour or more, and decided to use the bathroom for me to find. This happened yesterday. My brother and I went for a hike to stave off cabin fever from self-isolating. We chose a pretty remote trail to lower the risk of coming into contact with other people. I was walking ahead of my brother, and the gravel on the track was making our footsteps sound really loud. Deep in thought, I was listening to the rhythm of his footsteps behind me. About 20 minutes in, I started hearing other footsteps, starting off faint and getting louder, until they were the same pitch as his, but they were much faster, like a running rhythm. They suddenly came to a halt, and I could hear the motion of someone stopping on gravel, that sudden, sharp, rocky sound, if you can imagine it. I assumed there must just be someone running or jogging on the track, and sure enough, I saw a shadow to the side of me appear, which looked like a person's head next to mine, as though they were right behind me. I stopped and turned around to let them pass, because the track was narrow. However, when I turned around, it was just my brother staring back at me. He was confused as to why I'd stopped, so I asked if he was running a second ago, and he said no. I asked if there'd been anyone behind him, and he said that he wasn't aware of anyone. I thought it was strange, but just let it go and carried on. About 5 minutes later, we came around a corner, and there was this smell of just pure death, like a really strong off-meat smell. We figured it was a dead animal and kept going. We reached the hike lookout about 20 minutes later, chilled out for a bit, then headed back. We passed the death smell, and then around the exact same spot where it had happened before. I started hearing the running sounds again. I ignored it this time because it was starting to freak me out, and I just picked up the pace to get back to the car. I told my mom, and she joked that the smell of death must have been a dead jogger, and I was being haunted by them, to which I laughed at the time. But now I'm wondering, what if it was? Maybe I should have investigated the smell. It was a humid night in July when 3 buddies and I were camping in a small spot by a river. That night, alcohol and weed were flowing. It was around 12 a.m. to 1 a.m. when we were all cracking jokes and having a good time sitting around the fire, when one of my friends went quiet and had a weird look on his face. So I asked him what's up, thinking that he's not feeling good or just needs to lay down. But he responded, saying that he feels like someone is watching us. So I told him that everything's going to be okay and just to relax, and if he wants, he can sleep in the truck. Well, later that night, we all went into our tents, and I instantly passed out. But I was woken up by my friend who I was sharing the tent with. He was sitting up with his pocket knife out. I asked him what was going on, and he told me to just listen, which I did. And I heard leaves crunching and branches breaking, and listening for a bit longer, it sounded like someone with boots walking around. I got concerned because none of my friends were wearing any boots. After laying there for a while, the footsteps stopped right next to the tent, and we saw a figure standing there as we were trying to figure out what we should do. Our best idea was to jump out of the tent and ambush whoever this was. It sounded like a good idea at the time, so my buddy and I jumped out of the tent, and we were faced with a 6'5", 280-pound man with an unkempt beard and hair. After standing in front of the man for a second, my friend took off running towards the truck, and me trying to clumsily follow, I crashed into the tent where my other 2 friends were sleeping. As I was laying on the ground in fear, I saw that the man was holding a machete. So I yelled, "Get the gun." We didn't have a gun, it was just a bluff. Well, my bluff worked, and the man dropped his machete and took off into the woods. We didn't hesitate and instantly packed up and went to the truck. After going back to the house to calm down and get a bit more sleep, the next morning we all went back to the spot, fully armed for anything. Once we got to the spot, we found the machete, and after following the tracks for a bit, we also found a small axe. We all agreed to never go back to that spot or talk about what happened again. Back when I was 14 years old, my family had moved from our home in England to the Republic of Ireland, where we lived for a further 6 years. We had first moved to the northwest of the country, but after a year of living there, we then relocated to the Irish Midlands, as my dad had gotten a new job working in Dublin. My parents had bought a cottage on the outskirts of a very small village that was a stopping point from one of the larger towns to the next. This village was so small and remote, there was basically nothing to do. But not long after moving here and taking to exploring the surrounding area with my border collie, Maisie, I eventually found a large stretch of bogland containing a man-made forest. Every weekend or half-term away from school, I took to walking this area with my dog, in which I would follow along a railway line used for transporting peat. However, after months of trekking this very same bogland, I eventually stopped going there. I can't quite recall the reason why, but maybe it was because I always felt as though I was trespassing, which I wasn't, or because the bogland was so bumpy and uneven, I always came home with horrific blisters. Although I stopped going to this bogland to walk my dog, outside of one of the nearby towns where I went to school, there was a public forest. Because this forest was a 20-minute drive away, my dad would take me and Maisie there, drop us off, and then pick us up again 2 or 3 hours later. What I loved about these woods was that it was always quiet, only with the occasional family, dog walker, or jogger passing us by. On one particular evening, I'd gone back to these woods with Maisie, where my dad would later pick us up after running some errands. Making our way along the trail, the evening had already started to dim. Wanting to make my way back to the car park before it got too dark, I decided to take a shortcut through the forest via one of the many narrow side trails. Following down one of these side trails, Maisie and I stumbled upon a small teepee-shaped hut made from logs. Loving a good game of hide-and-seek, I would sometimes hide inside this teepee when Maisie wasn't looking, where she would spend the next couple of minutes circling round the hut trying to find me, not realizing she could just go inside. Whether I played this game with Maisie that day, I'm not sure, but following down this exact same side trail, I turned to look behind me. Staring down the entryway, I then see a man walking 20 meters behind, having just taken this side trail. For some unknown reason, I had a strange instant feeling about this man, even though I'd only just noticed him. I can't remember or even describe the way this man was walking, but by the way he did so felt suspicious to me. Listening to my instincts, or perhaps just my paranoia, I quickly latch my lead back onto Maisie and hurriedly make my way down the trail. A few minutes later, although I'd reached back onto the main trail, the evening had already turned much darker. Again, turning to see if the man was behind me, I could still see him around the curve, only 10 meters away from me now. I did try to tell myself I was just being paranoid, and this man was most likely not following me. But my gut instinct still told me something was off. Thinking ahead, I pulled out my phone to call my dad, as to make sure he was already in the car park waiting for me. But there was no answer. Because there was no answer, I just assumed he was probably still driving, and because he was still driving, I just hoped my dad was nearly on his way. By the time I make it back to the car park, it was basically pitch black by now, and there was just one single car in the parking area. But it wasn't my dad's. Sitting down by a picnic bench to wait for him to come and get us All I could do was hope he would be coming soon, and that this strange man from the woods was not following me after all. Only a minute or two later, I could hear the footsteps of this very same man approaching through the darkness. Anxiously anticipating him pass by, I tried to distract myself on my phone, or at least make myself seem less approachable. Thankfully enough, the man just walks completely by me. Entering the car park, the man then gets in his vehicle, the only car in the car park, but he doesn't drive away. He just stays there, sat inside his car with both the engine and headlights turned on. 20 minutes must have gone by, but my dad still wasn't here, and yet this very same stranger was. Trying to call and text my dad to say I was waiting for him, I was met with no answer. While I continued waiting, I tried to rationalize why this man hadn't decided to drive off. Whatever reasons I came up with, they were not very convincing for me, and for those whole 20 minutes, or however many more minutes, I sat outside those woods in complete darkness, hearing nothing but the hum of this stranger's engine among the silent night air. What made this situation even more anxiety-inducing was that my dog Maisie had been endlessly whining by my feet, scraping dirt away beneath the bench to make a surprisingly deep hole. Maisie was in general a very nervous dog and basically whined at everything, but perhaps she too felt as though something about this situation wasn't right. Thankfully, after what felt like far longer than 20 or so minutes, the strange man, already with his engine and headlights on, reverses from his parking spot, exits out of the car park and onto the main road, leaving Maisie and I in peace. Although we were now alone, basically stranded outside of a dark forest, I couldn't help but feel a huge sigh of relief come over me. My dad did eventually come and get us, 10 minutes after the man had finally decided to drive off. Do you know what my dad's excuse was as to why he was so late? He forgot he had to come pick us up. I don't know if the man really was following me through the forest, and I definitely don't know why he just sat in his car for 20 minutes. But if I had to learn anything from that experience, it would be the following. 1. My dad can sometimes be a careless douche. And 2. Never hike through the forest alone, late in the evening. So this happened when I was about 17 during summer break. My friend and I went to visit another friend who was staying in this tiny remote village in Belarus for the summer. The house was his grandparents', and the whole place felt really isolated. Honestly, it was actually a lot of fun at first. We went swimming at a nearby lake every day, and at night, we'd stay up late just sitting by the water, listening to the kind of deafening silence you only get in the countryside, and talking for hours. During the day, we'd go mushroom picking, explore the area, take pictures, and just make some really good memories together. We stayed for a few weeks, but then one of my friends had to leave early because of some family stuff. The only way out was a bus that came twice a week, and she missed it. So she came back to our friend's place and asked if we could walk her to a nearby highway to try to hitch a ride. The main road was about 7 miles away, so we started walking. When we got there, it was midweek, and no cars passed at all. Most people were still at work in the city. As it got later, we decided to just walk back. On the way back, we passed through a few neighboring villages that were half abandoned. Honestly, it was pretty creepy, but we kept ourselves entertained by singing and joking around to keep the fear at bay. It was getting dark, and we still had about 4 miles left. Then we ended up on this road with dense forest on both sides. Suddenly, we started hearing noises coming from the trees. It was pitch dark and really unsettling. We tried to joke about it, but deep down, we all felt something was off. Then my friend pointed, and we saw 2 huge yellow eyes staring at us from the trees. We just kept walking in silence for a bit, until one of us nervously said, "Must be some wild fireflies messing with us." We laughed, but we all knew those definitely weren't fireflies. This was before cell phones, so there was no way to call anyone. We just had to keep moving and get back safely. As we got closer to the village, two of us heard a female voice coming from the forest. We looked at each other, both realizing we heard it, while the third friend was talking and didn't notice. I got goosebumps. It sounded so real, and the fact that I wasn't the only one who heard it made it even creepier. We didn't say anything until we got back to the house. Here's where it gets even weirder. In Slavic folklore, there's not just the Leshy, the forest spirit who protects the woods and sometimes plays tricks on people, but also the Rusalka. Rusalki are these mythological female spirits often connected to lakes and rivers. They're usually described as beautiful women with long hair, sometimes said to lure people, especially at night, with their singing or voices. We'd been hanging out at the lake so many nights, and then to hear a mysterious female voice coming from the trees later on, it definitely made us wonder if we'd gotten a little too close to something supernatural. We still joke about those unhinged fireflies, but deep down, we all know we saw and heard something we can't explain. Between the abandoned houses, the glowing eyes in the forest, and that eerie female voice, it was honestly one of the scariest and strangest experiences of my life. And yeah, I still think about those nights at the lake and wonder what might have been watching or listening to us from the darkness.